Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 79. The mission of our Digging Deeper moments is to take God's Word to God's world. We are so glad that you've joined us. Last week, we looked at two of the three ways that scholars identify the sons of God, also known in the Hebrew as B'nai Elohim, discussed in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 2. It says, "Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose." Some scholars identify the sons of God as the godly line of Seth, who married women from the ungodly line of Cain. Other scholars identify the sons of God as powerful tyrant kings, the men of renown, the heroes of old, mentioned in Genesis 6:4. For more on these, please go to Digging Deeper moment number 78. Tonight, we want to look at the third and most controversial way that scholars identify the sons of God, the B'nai Elohim, which is the belief that the sons of God are fallen angels who cohabitated with women and produced offspring called the Nephilim, or giants. What this view has going for it is its historical context. Ancient Near Eastern culture was filled with stories of angelic beings, or gods, cohabitating with women and producing giants, or demigods. In fact, the Book of Enoch, an ancient Hebrew apocalyptic religious text written between 300 and 200 BC, identifies the sons of God as the fallen angels and their offsprings as the giants, or the Nephilim, of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Speaking of the fallen angels, 1 Enoch chapter 15, verse 3 says, "Why and for what cause have you left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and had sex with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of the earth, and begotten giants as your sons?" So according to the Book of Enoch and other ancient myths, the sons of God were the angels or gods that left their appointed positions in heaven to cohabitate with human women. These unnatural unions produced the giants, the Nephilim. 1 Enoch chapter 15, verse 8 goes on to say, "And now the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits on the earth." And so we see that the Book of Enoch is connecting the fallen angels with this story in Genesis 6. Now, another strong argument for the position that these sons of God are the fallen angels is found in the context, in the content of New Testament scripture itself. Both 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 and Jude verse 6 suggest that the sons of God are the fallen angels who left their habitation and had relations with human women. Yes, you did hear me correct. Both 2 Peter and Jude seem to imply that that's what Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is talking about, but we're going to have to look at that a little bit more closely. Jude even goes so far as to quote the Book of Enoch in Jude verse 14, and because Peter mirrors what Jude says, he doesn't say it exactly, but he's close. I'm only going to address the book of Jude at this time, in this lesson, to save us some time. Jude 6 says, "And the angels who did not keep their proper domain, but left their own abode, he, God, has reserved in everlasting chains under darkness for the judgment of the great day." The great day is the final judgment. In verse 14, Jude goes on to say, "Now Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied about these men also, saying, Behold, the Lord comes with 10,000s of his saints, and to execute judgment on all, to convict all who are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds which they have committed in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which the ungodly sinners have spoken against him." This is a direct quote from 1 Enoch chapter 1, verse 9. Just listen. "And behold, he comes with 10,000 of his holy ones, saints, to execute judgment on all, and to destroy all the ungodly, the wicked, and to convict all flesh of all the works of their ungodliness which they have ungodly committed, and of all the hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." Now, I've not looked these two up in the Greek, but these are pretty close translations. I don't know exactly how the Greek plays out because I don't have a Greek translation of Enoch. But they're very close, and you can see that Jude is quoting from the Book of Enoch. Now, as I said, since Peter says similar things, he says basically the same thing in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 4 through the rest of the chapter. Because of this, scholars conclude that both Peter and Jude believed that the sons of God in Genesis 6, that Jude and Peter believed they were the fallen angels and the Nephilim, or giants, who were their offspring. But this view has some weaknesses that need to be considered. First, if Genesis 6:1 is referring to the sons of God as the fallen angels, it would mean that Moses is borrowing from the myths of his culture. But this goes against what he did in the creation account of Genesis chapter 1, where he goes out of his way to not include the myths of his day. And so this kind of goes against the flow of the book of Genesis. A second weakness is that the ancient myths and the book of Enoch itself focus the blame of the horrible conditions of the world on the gods or the fallen angels. Let me say that again. This is really important. A second weakness of this view is that the ancient myths and the book of Enoch specifically blame the horrible condition of the world on the gods or the fallen angels, not on humanity. 1 Enoch chapter 10 verse 7 says, "And healed the whole earth which the angels have ruined." And 1 Enoch chapter 10 verse 8 says, "The whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin." Hear that? To him ascribe all sin. Azazel was one of the chief fallen angels who cohabitated with women according to the book of Enoch. But notice, however, that God places the ruining of the earth on humanity when it says the following in Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 7. "The Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth." He doesn't say the wickedness of angels. He says the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart, whose heart? Man's heart, was only evil continually. "And the Lord was sorry that he made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created." And so the whole content of the story is focusing on man's sinfulness. Now, I'm not saying there's not a spiritual influence. We're going to address that in an entire different set of digging deeper moments. But we need to see that Moses is going out of his way here in chapter 6 to let us know very clearly that the reason God is judging the world with a worldwide flood is that man's sin is great in the earth, and it's man who is corrupt, and it's man who is violent. So that's a very big weakness in this fallen angel theory. A third weakness in this view, that the sons of God, or the fallen angels, and the Nephilim giants are their offspring, and the offspring of human women, is that the size of the giants said to be produced by this cohabitation is really just ludicrous. Now, I don't claim to be an expert on this subject, but in all my reading, and I've done some reading on this, I have yet to see a scholar address this point. In 1 Enoch chapter 7, verse 3, it says this, "And the women became pregnant, and they bare large giants whose height was 3,000 cubits." Do you know how tall 3,000 cubits is? Cubit's 18 inches, or at least a smaller cubit. There's actually a bigger cubit, so this was between 18 inches and 21 inches. But if you just take the smaller of the two, that's 4,500 feet tall. Can you imagine giving a 4,500-foot baby a bottle? I mean, we need to think about this. And the main reason this is a problem is that scholars like to connect the giants of Genesis chapter 6, who lived before the flood, with the giants Israel faced in Numbers 13, verses 32 and 33, which mention the Nephilim, and specifically, who are after the flood. But here's the problem. The giants Israel faced when going into the promised land were not 4,500 feet tall. They may have been 8 to 10 feet tall, or maybe even 11 feet tall, but they were not over 4,000 feet tall. And so what's happening here, what you have to look for when you read materials on this subject, is there's a tendency for this myth to be forced onto the text. You always have to be careful of this when you're doing biblical exegesis. So you might ask, Pastor Bob, how do we explain Peter and Jude's statements about the angels that sin? Well, that's really not that difficult. We know from history that the early Christians, as well as Jewish folks, that they took these stories from Enoch and from these myths very seriously. We also know that in the early church, the church would read from other books in their church service other than the Bible. And one of those books they liked to read from was the Book of Enoch. And so you got to remember, back in the early days of Christianity, in the 1st century and the 2nd century, you have to understand that the New Testament wasn't written yet. So they mostly read the Old Testament, and they read extra biblical books, one of them being Enoch. And then they would read the letters from the various apostles that became our Bible. But when they would get in their service, they would read from various sources like we do today. You know, when a preacher preaches in a church service, it's not uncommon for him to quote other writers and other scholars and other preachers in their services. And that's what they did back then. And so what Peter and Jude, at least in my estimation, seem to be doing is that they're not making an argument for interpreting the sons of God as the fallen angels. What Peter and Jude are doing here is using very familiar stories that their congregations would have been familiar with to support the case that they are making in the writings that they're writing. And the point is this, that immorality has no place in the church and will be punished by God. If you read Peter and you read Jude, that is the point that these writers are making. And what both of them do, and it almost looks like copied off each other, that's how close Jude and Peter are, is that they both cite 3 examples to support what they're saying. The first is in Jude verse 5, which talks about how the Israelites were destroyed after coming out of Egypt. This is a reference to the golden calf incident found in Exodus 33. The people, it says, they ate and they drank and they rose up to play. Well, that playing part is they engaged in immorality. The second is Jude 6, which is what we're talking about now, is the story of the fallen angels from the Book of Enoch. So this is an extra biblical story that they were familiar with, but it's about immorality and an unnatural union between angels and humans. The third is Sodom and Gomorrah, and I don't have to explain that one. So all 3 examples warn of how God judges immorality. But neither Peter or Jude are focusing on making the case that the sons of God in Genesis 6 are fallen angels. They simply use this story to prove their point because it was familiar. And as I said, preachers do this all the time to make points today. Now we're out of time, and so we'll have to pick it up here next week. If this lesson helped you, please share it with a friend, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel. I hope to see you next week. God bless.